the Hebrew boys. Let's go Exodus 1 verse 16. And he said, when you do the office of a midwife to the Hebrew women and see them upon the stools, if it be a son, then you shall kill him. But if it be a daughter, then she shall live. So he said, if it be a son, you kill that son. But if it be a daughter, then that daughter shall live. So this is Pharaoh giving this charge to the midwives. Now these midwives refused Pharaoh's order because they said, hey Pharaoh, by the time we get to the Hebrew women, these women have already given birth. You know, they already given birth. They don't even need a midwife, Pharaoh. And plus, these two Hebrew women, these two Hebrew midwives were afraid of Yah, and they knew that the Hebrews were the people of Yah. And so they said, we're not going to do this. So in verse 22 of Exodus 1, Pharaoh had to come back, and he charged his people. Since the midwives wouldn't do it, Pharaoh got his people to do it. Look what Pharaoh says in Exodus 1:22. And Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, every son that is born you shall cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive. So he's telling them, every Hebrew, this is Pharaoh giving his people, charging his people, making his people child murderers. Child murderers. This is how important it is for Pharaoh to reduce the population of Israel. Now, why did he choose the sons to take out of the population? Well, one primary reason. Remember, Pharaoh is upset because the Hebrew population is growing, but he's more fearful that the Hebrews would join on to an outside enemy and then come to war against Egypt and overtake Egypt. That's his fear. So in those days, only men fought the wars. You know, the men were the warriors. The men were the warriors. So if you remove that warrior population, and then you can kill two birds with one stone. You can stop that population from growing. If you take the man out of any population, that population will stop growing, because it is the man that, you know, the man and woman has to come together for, you know, to produce offspring. So if you remove the man, then you just have the woman there. You have removed the warrior, and you have removed the means of that population or that nation of growing. So Pharaoh came up with a wise, slick plan. So he said, kill all the sons, but leave all the daughters. And I hope you see the parallel that's even happening to us today. Why do you think the plight of the so-called black man is so bad? Because this same plan is going into effect in our time. But back here, every son that is born you shall cast into the river, and every daughter you shall live. Now, very important right here. Now let's break this down. Remember, Pharaoh gave the order that all his people become child murderers. Kill children, babies. You go pick up a baby, little crying baby, throw that baby in the river. You got to be a stone cold-hearted person to do that. But Pharaoh is giving the order, everybody, all of his people have to do this. So this brings us to the story, one of the most famous stories of the Israelites' time in Egypt, and that's the story of Moses. Moses was born during this exact time that Pharaoh said, kill all baby boys. Moses was born during this time. Now let's break this down and let's see what Yah, the Most High, is showing us here. We go into Exodus 2. Exodus chapter 2. We just left Exodus chapter 1, and we see that crazy Pharaoh is saying, kill all these Hebrew boys. So now we're in Exodus 2. And Exodus 2 verses 1 through 3 explains Moses' birth. We're going to pick it up at Exodus 2 verse 5. Because Moses was born during this time, as I stated. Moses' mother knew that the Egyptians were killing the Hebrew boys when they were born. So Moses' mother tried to keep Moses and hide him for 3 months. But she could no longer do it. Because you know how a 3-month-old child is. I mean, they cry for everything. And that's their only form of communication. So they, you know, when they're hungry, they have to cry. When they need a diaper change, they cry. When they're sleepy, they cry, because they don't know how to communicate this yet. So they cry for everything. So she had this little baby in her tent, in her, you know, wherever they lived, and she could not hide him because, you know, he's constantly crying. So what she did was that she built a basket, which the scripture calls an ark. She built a basket, and she put the little child in there, and she floated the child down the Nile River. This child is Moses. And the reason she floated him down the Nile River, brothers and sisters, is because she was located, the Hebrews during this time was located in northern Egypt in a land called Goshen. They were located in the land called Goshen, located in northern Egypt. Remember, Pharaoh gave the charge of all his people. If you see these Hebrew boys, dump them in the river. Kill them. These Hebrew baby boys, dump them in the river and kill them. So, while they are, she could not have snuck Moses out of Egypt on land. Out of the area of Goshen, northern Egypt, on land, because one of those Egyptians would have saw her, would have saw that child, that little baby boy in her hand, would have killed it right before her eyes. So the only way she can get the baby out of northern Egypt was to put him on the Nile River and float him down the river. And so this was her intention. She would rather do that than to see her child be killed right before her face. So what happens? This is when the hand of the Most High is just powerful, because Exodus 2 verse 5 says, "And the daughter of Pharaoh came down to wash herself at the river, and her maidens walked along by the river's side. And when she saw the ark among the flags, she sent her maid to fetch it." So that ark, that's the basket that Moses' mother built, and that's the basket that she put baby Moses in. So this basket went down to the doorsteps of Pharaoh's palace. This is where the daughter of Pharaoh was out there taking her bath. In verse 6, "And when she had opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the babe wept. And she had compassion on him, and said, This is one of the Hebrews' children." Now remember, this is Pharaoh's own daughter. Remember, in Exodus 1, Pharaoh charged all his people. All his people. So he's charging all the native Egyptians to kill these Hebrew baby boys, throw them into the river. That's what he says, right? So we see that Pharaoh's daughter, she is of Pharaoh's people, right? That's his own flesh and blood. She is in the river already. So she see this ark, and she see that there's a baby in there, and she recognized that this child is one of the Hebrews' children. So immediately she is supposed to dunk that baby into the river where she stands and drown it. That's what she's supposed to do. But let's see, what did she do? Let's go to verse 10. Let's go to verse 10. It says, "And the child grew, and she brought him unto Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she called his name Moses, and she said, Because I drew him out of the water." Now, if we go back up to verses 7 through 9, it'll tell us that Moses' little sister Miriam followed right behind that basket because she wanted to see what would happen to her little baby brother. And she saw when the basket reached Pharaoh's daughter. And she looked and she saw, and when she didn't see Pharaoh's daughter drowning the child, she went to Pharaoh's daughter and asked her, do she want her to go get one of the Hebrew women to nurse that child? And lo and behold, the Pharaoh's daughter said, "Yeah, go get me one of the Hebrew women, and I will pay her wages for nursing this child." Because remember, there was no Similac in that day. There was no corner market where you can go out and buy baby formula and nurse the child. So when she sent little Moses' sister out to go get a woman to nurse that child, because she's saying, go get me a woman that has a baby, that just had a baby that has milk in her breast, so she can nurse the child. Because that's what breasts are given to women for, brothers and sisters, to nurse children. Today is so wicked what women are doing with their breasts. Getting all kind of stuff put in them to make them big, and breasts is just there to nurse the children. So to get back to our presentation, just had to throw that out there though. So Moses' sister went and got her mother, and Moses' mother actually raised him. She was his nanny. She was his babysitter, if you want to use those words. And right here in verse 10 it says, "And when the child grew, she brought him unto Pharaoh's daughter." She, being Moses' mother, she brought her son back to Pharaoh's daughter. And look at this. And Moses, and when it says "and he," is saying Moses became her son. Oh, wow. Moses became the stepson to Pharaoh's daughter. How can that be when Pharaoh himself said, "All my people, kill all these Hebrew boys at birth, throw them in the river"? But yet Pharaoh's own daughter is bringing a Hebrew boy to Pharaoh and saying that this is her son? The only way that can happen is if Moses, the Hebrew, look exactly like Pharaoh and Pharaoh's daughter, if he looked exactly like the Egyptians. Because what we get in here, the understanding from the scriptures, that Pharaoh did not even know that Moses was not his flesh and blood grandson. He did not know. Because had he known, he would have killed Moses instantly. Because he gave the decree to his own people to become child murderers. So how do you think his people feel? They are out there being stone-hearted, stone-cold murderers of children. And yet here's Pharaoh, having one up in his palace, got all the rights, all the privileges of his family of a king. I'm just throwing you the example. If Pharaoh knew that Moses was a Hebrew, how could he go to his people and tell them, well, I got a Hebrew in my household, he's going to stay here, but the rest of y'all, go out and continue to murder those Hebrew children? It doesn't make sense. The only way Moses survived, because if you go into the book of Acts in the New Testament, I think Acts 7:23, Acts chapter 7 verse 23, it states that Moses stayed in the house of Pharaoh for 40 years. Moses was a 40-year-old man, and Pharaoh did not know that was his own flesh and blood grandson. So it was like this. This is deep. Pharaoh looked into the eyes of Moses as Moses was a little child and said, this is my flesh and blood grandson. He looked into the eyes of Moses as Moses was a young boy and said, this is my flesh and blood grandson. He looked into the eyes of Moses as Moses was a teenager, as Moses was a young man in his 20s and 30s, and said, this is my flesh and blood grandson. He looked into the eyes of Moses as a grown man at 40 years old and said, this is my flesh and blood grandson. So for 40 years, Pharaoh could not tell that this Hebrew was not an Egyptian. Moses lived the first 40 years of his life as an Egyptian. Now remember, he was raised by his mother, so he always knew he was a Hebrew. Because his mother was his nanny, his mother was his babysitter, and she probably told him that, and she told him to keep that a secret. But Moses raised into the palace of Pharaoh, brothers and sisters, 40 years, and Pharaoh did not know that this man was not an Egyptian. The only way that can happen is that the Hebrews had to look just like the Egyptians. The Hebrews had to look just like the Egyptians. We're going to prove that. Scholars